Okay, so we will be having the CRS Plenary. I'm sorry. All right, here at the Great Hall. So basically, it's about, can new financing models contribute to solving youth employment challenges on a large scale by the Catholic Relief Services? So I would like to call on the speakers. I'm so sorry. So Beth Collins, Managing Director, Impact Investing, Catholic Relief Services. Cyrielle Auffray, Manager, Global Development Incubator. Ryan Moore, Director, Evaluation, Millennium Change Challenge Corporation. And our moderator for today, Gabriela Carmo, Program Associate, Global Opportunity Youth Network at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions. So give them a big hand.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Gabriela Carmo, as my colleague here said. I am the Program Associate at Global Opportunity Youth Network, which is in the Aspen Institute's Forum for Community Solutions. I provide programmatic and support and coordination, both for our global development partnerships and then also for our youth leadership initiatives. So I'm really pleased to be joined by some of my colleagues here and be moderating a session on financing youth solutions for employment and entrepreneurship. The youth employment livelihood sectors has undergone really significant change over the past decade, and it's only expected to go through more change in the coming years. Over 600 million young people are disconnected from work, from education, or informally employed in very precarious conditions. And so really the youth unemployment challenge is honestly one of the biggest challenges we're facing in the development world in the 21st century. And then compound that over with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had an enduring impact on both work systems and also education systems. The changing nature of work as well, like with the rise of automation and digitization, really has negatively impacted low-valued manufacturing jobs and also emerging digital jobs, really leading to a high influx of workers that this leading growing sector and job systems can't really support. So with that said, a set of appropriate financing mechanisms is needed to really address this full range of challenges that the youth employment sector faces. However, I know that you all are here and you all are, implementers. Many youth employment stakeholders are either unfamiliar with these tools, with these diverse financing mechanism tools, or we, because I'm also an implementer, we don't know how they can be applied to really achieve our goals. And so with that said, to address this issue, Global Development Incubator, Catholic Relief Services, and the Global Opportunity Youth Network conducted a comprehensive landscape study of existing financing tools to really address youth employment and entrepreneurship, from grants and government funding all the way to commercial investments. These findings of this work are captured in our FinYouth report, which highlights the most effective and promising financing tools. In this plenary, we'll be hearing from CRS on how this work came about and its importance to its institution. We'll hear from our friends at GDI on the key findings of the report. And finally, we'll hear from Millennium Challenge Corporation, who will share an example of a financing tool that was used to support youth employment objectives in Morocco. However, as we explore these innovative financing tools, I think it's really important for us to address and center equity in this conversation. As a young woman myself from Brazil, I think really I've encountered, and my colleagues and my fellow young people have encountered structural barriers and glass ceilings in this space. And so in our research, we actually found that these financing models can really be used as powerful tools to both leverage and create social impact and create more economic inclusion for young people. And so as we begin to look at these tools, I think it's really important that we think about these tools to advance sustainable youth livelihoods for communities globally, but most importantly for those who have the least amount of access to those opportunities. So with that said, I'd like to introduce us all to our panelists who will be presenting this morning, and then afterwards we'll open up for questions. We're also excited to have with us a graphic designer, Mark Korsak from Sea and Colors. He will be capturing the presentation and discussion. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. without further ado, oh yes, let's celebrate. So my colleagues here are very well accomplished, so unfortunately for me, I have to read. Fortunately for you guys, because you're going to hear from them. So we have with us first Beth Collins. She is the Managing Director of Impact Investing at Catholic Relief Services. She structured and led CRS's Impact Investing and Innovative Finance Strategy and activities since its inception in 2015. Leading global humanitarian development agency, CRS touches more than 250 million lives across 120 countries. Beth also leads CRS's advocacy efforts on impact investing, having produced 2 Vatican investing conferences, acting as chairs Caritas International and Impact Investing Working Group. Prior to that, she served in the leadership team of Clinton Health Access Initiative, and earlier she has over 15 years of private sector executive leadership experience in both investment banking and startup design and execution. Whew, it's a lot. Yes, so welcome, Beth. We also have Cyrielle Auffray. She is the manager at the Global Development Incubator, an incubator of social ventures in the international development space, where she provides strategic and technical support to the Global Opportunity Youth Network. I'm very grateful for her support. A network of communities advancing collaborative place-based solutions for youth employment. Cyrielle led the development of the Fin Youth Report, so she is probably the most well-versed and the expert in the room here. So we're really grateful to have you here, Cyrielle. And then finally, we have with us Ryan Moore, the Director of Evaluation at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, leading monitoring evaluation for Mozambique and overseeing evaluation staff across education, WASH, and capacity building sectors. From 2016 to 2023, he led MCC's results-based financing for inclusive employment program in Morocco, which paid providers for job placement and retention results for women and vulnerable youth, which we'll hear more about today. So without further ado, I will pass it on to you.
Sorry, guys. I don't know about you all, but my experience with youth in the past 24 hours have been school trips in the hotels. I don't know if anybody else is. Yeah, so I'm a little bit, if I start blabbering, you'll understand I didn't sleep very well last night. So it's good that I stand over here so I can see what I'm saying. So thank you, Gabriela, and everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here. So as you all know, CRS is one of the largest humanitarian development organizations in the world. And through our Vision 2030, our strategy, we seek to have, catalyze impact at scale across 5 goal areas. And the one that brings us here today is that all youth are empowered to thrive. And CRS set up also this strategic change platform led by the wonderful Petula Nash and her great team, there's many of them here, who I've been really happy to meet, that is scaling youth livelihoods and leadership. So what does that have to do with the work that I do? I'm hoping I go in the right direction. Yep, there we go. So we started having conversations around should CRS even be involved in impact investing, and it came from Pope Francis saying it's time to put the economy in the service of people. It's just for us, just another tool in the toolbox. This isn't the answer to everything, but we use it as another tool to advance the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. We have a 2-prong investment strategy. The first is that we work with our board investment subcommittee to invest in institutional quality market rate impact investing funds. We take a percentage of our reserve to do that. But what I'm really here to talk about today is the second bucket of the work that we do, which is really around our programmatic footprint. And we lead the design and implementation of investment vehicles that are going to be riskier because of the communities that we work with. We call them blended solutions, and what I mean by that is that we have technical assistance that's funded by grants or philanthropy, and then we have what I say are like firewalled investment vehicles that make loans, and I'll give you a couple of examples, that make loans to SMEs or water service providers, you'll see, and we also make some direct investments. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Let's see if this, oops, wrong one. First is Azure. It's a first fund we set up. We on-lend to local water service providers in El Salvador, Honduras, with plans to go to Guatemala. And this is an initiative that provides safe drinking water and sanitation services. We've reached over 130,000 individuals with these new services. And again, CRS leads the technical assistance piece, and we have a separate investment vehicle that makes the loans. We've recently set up a new initiative called Isidro. It's a pilot, and it's investing in locally run value chain companies, ag value chain SMEs, and we really are in a space that nobody else is. These are companies that have been on a journey with us from grants, and they've worked very, very closely with our local teams, and now they're looking for more commercial capital. And we're just getting started with this one. And we're also able to invest in other people's funds that would look like our funds because they're working with the same kinds of communities. And so we've invested in Cordaid's fund, which Cordaid is a partner Caritas of ours. They're the Dutch Caritas. And as you can see, one of their metrics is youth jobs. They're looking to create youth and jobs for youth and women. One of the companies I realized after we put this together, I'm looking at Petula that I'm not mentioning, but I should have, is we made a one-off investment in a small company in Madagascar whose main objective is hiring youth. It's a solar light company, and it's a franchise model where the youth are the franchisees, and it's called Giro Bay. So why are we, what are we talking about today? We are baby stepping our way in, but we really are looking for solutions, innovative finance solutions that can really take the youth livelihoods and youth employment to scale. And it's something that Petula and I have discussed over the years, like what can we be doing? We've started with this very small social impact bond in Mexico in collaboration with Youth Build, Social Finance, and the government of Nuevo León, Mexico as the outcome payer. I know that there is some discussion at the moment around, social impact bonds or pay for success models, and we've been working on this for quite some time, so we're looking forward to it being a pilot and then seeing where we go from there. But what we're here to talk about today is the second piece. And over the years, we've had conversations with the GOYN and GDI and others around what should we be doing, what other things can we be investing in? And I'm like, I don't know, what's working? What is out there, what is working? Let's not do something just without having that information, sorry. So we worked collaboratively with Cyrielle and the GDI team and GOYN. And, we recognize that there are a lot of new financing models, but what are they? There's not a lot of opportunities to kind of come together to understand what's there, and there's not a lot of guidance. So we were really looking to map the landscape and to do some assessing and saying, what's working, what's not working, and then do we have to set up our own vehicle or can we invest in somebody else's, that's working? So this is really, I'm turning it over this wonderful woman here who has done the lion's share of this work, which is looking at 200 plus programs and reviewed 43 case studies, and there are 12 key recommendations and 11 highlighted financing models, and I'm going to now turn it over to her to tell you where we are with that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Beth, for the introduction and setting the context for this work, and also for all the support that you've given GDI throughout this project. It couldn't have happened without your support and Petula's support, who's also here. So I am Cyrielle Auffray. I am a manager at the Global Development Incubator. As Gabby mentioned, we are an incubator of social ventures in the international development space. And basically what we do is that we seek out innovative ideas that have the potential to transform entire fields, and we work with them to bring them to life. So as Beth explained, FinYouth is a project that we have been working on for the most of the past year. and which looks at the landscape of financing solutions for youth employment and entrepreneurship, with the goal of identifying the most promising products and models that we can accelerate. And so we're very excited to be finishing that research phase and to move on to the exciting part of trying to identify which of these products we're going to be able to move forward. So today is only the first step in the dissemination of this work. We're actually still planning to publish the report in the summer, so it's not out yet. But we're starting to share the findings with a broader audience, and we're very excited about that. So Beth laid out the key challenges that we are trying to address with the report, and so we could really spend the entire morning just diving down into as individual findings. But what I want to do this morning, considering our limited time, is just leave you with three key takeaways. Very simple, just very big picture stuff, but which will hopefully trigger some thinking. So the first one, if this is working, I decided I would start with something extremely easy since it's still the morning and we're still drinking our coffee. So different issues require different solutions, starting with the obvious. So what we mean by that is that this is just meant to be a helpful starting point, is that a thorough understanding of the underlying causes of youth unemployment in a given community is essential to determine which financing mechanisms can be helpful in that context. So not, we can't just use any kind of financing model, plug it into a community and expect it to work. We have to understand the underlying causes first. And so what we do in the report is that we build a framework that breaks down youth unemployment into 4 main issues and 15 sort of possible impact levers to address these issues. So the 4 main issues, which you can see here, are going to be very familiar to anyone working in the youth employment space, so I'm going to go through them quickly. So the first one is when you have a supply gap or skills gaps. That's when there are jobs available in the economy, but young people do not have the right skills to access those jobs. The second issue, is the demand gap or jobs gap, and that's when the economy is just not creating enough jobs for the number of young people that are entering the labor market. So they may have the right skills, but there's just not enough opportunities in the market. And so for that particular issue, we're going to be looking at the job creation side. Then you can have a situation where you have young people with the right skills, you have jobs in the labor market, but for whatever reason, the connection is not happening. So there's a matching issue in the labor market. And then finally, the fourth issue, which is related to the 3 other ones, but slightly separate, is that young people are very vulnerable, even when employed, to any kind of economic setback. And that can be illness, it can be a bad crop year for youth in agriculture, or a number of different issues. And we thought that was really important to bring into the context of that discussion on youth employment and entrepreneurship, because if we connect young people to income-generating opportunities, but they do not have the ability to build long-term wealth, then the circle perpetuates and we haven't really solved the issue. So these are the 4 main issues we use to guide the analysis in the report. And I'm not going to go into each of those impact levels that we've identified for each of those 4 issues. But what I would point out is just that we've separated those different impact levels that you see here into 2 different categories. On one side, we have sort of youth solutions. So these are solutions that direct funding directly towards youth. So think about student loans or seed funding for youth entrepreneurs. So these are the things that you see in dark blue on this slide. And the second category is solutions that fund other parts of the ecosystem. So that direct funding, not directly towards youth, but to other parts of the ecosystem that ultimately still lead to a positive impact on youth employment or entrepreneurship. And we call that ecosystem solutions. So that's, for instance, funding for businesses that have the potential to hire youth. And generally, at a high level, what we find in the report is that the first thing is most of the funding in the youth employment and entrepreneurship space is going to the skilling side, so the first line in this model, and more recently to the entrepreneurship side, but with a very narrow focus on entrepreneurs of the youth entrepreneurs that push social enterprises or high growth tech-based ventures, and not so much livelihoods entrepreneurs. So the first thing that we want to show with the report is that the universe of solutions for youth employment and entrepreneurship is way broader than those two categories, and we need to look at the entire system. The second thing that we want to show is that those ecosystem solutions, so solutions that direct funding not directly towards youth, but towards the broader ecosystem, are extremely important and are not necessarily receiving enough attention. So when we are directing all funding towards skilling programs for young people, critical piece, but if you don't have enough jobs in the economy to absorb those young people once they are skilled, you haven't really solved the issue. And so, for instance, in some places, we're going to have to look at how can we fund SMEs that have the potential to hire youth, rather than just skilling programs. The second takeaway that I want to share, I'm going to just very quickly on this slide. So what we do in the report is that for each of those issue and solutions, we look then at specifically which financing mechanisms can be used to support those solutions. And we do then a product analysis that looks at what product works, what are the challenges, what are the benefits, what are the best practices, and generally at a high level, how scalable, effective, and sustainable are they. So this is really to provide a guide to stakeholders as to what is out there for each of the issues that exist. The second takeaway I want to leave you with this morning is that there's a lot of discussions on how do we bring more funding for youth employment and entrepreneurship, and not so much discussion on how are we using the existing funding that is already available for youth employment and entrepreneurship. Again, specifically on the skilling side, there is a lot of funding that is being directed at programs where we have limited information on the effectiveness of those programs in placing young people into jobs. And we can use financing mechanisms to create incentives, different incentives for skilling providers to focus more on retention, more on placement, rather than just the delivery of training activities. So one example of such financing mechanisms is an outcomes fund. I'm not going to get into the details of that structure because I'm being told that I'm already over time. But basically, an outcomes fund is a structure that rewards skilling providers based on the placement and retention rates that they achieve, rather than paying them on the delivery of training activities. And we can get into the Q&A, into the mechanics of that, how that works. This is just one example of a financing mechanism that can change incentives in the system. And there are a lot of other interesting models that can do the same thing, and Ryan will share a different example in just a minute. Not all of these models are necessarily scalable, and this is something that we discuss at length in the report, but they're really important in creating a shift in mindsets and approaches more towards outcomes rather than just outputs and activities. And so the final piece that I want to leave you with this morning, so this is just an example of how we describe the products in the report. So we have 11 highlighted products, and for each of them we provide a structure, some information about the scale that can be achieved with them, the design parameters, how we can make them more inclusive, and generally what key success factors you need to make them effective. And so the final takeaway that I want to leave you with is that if we want to achieve scale and sustainability, which we absolutely need to, since the global youth employment challenge is really daunting, we have millions of young people that are out of work today, we need solutions that are going to be able to reach tens of thousands of young people, not just a few hundreds. And there are only 3 ways to reach sustainability at scale. 1 is government adoption, 2 is commercial adoption, and 3 is community structures, such as savings groups, to some extent. And so what this means is we really need to be working across sectors when we are piloting, implementing, and scaling up those financing models. And yes, working with governments can be really difficult, especially when you're trying to experiment with new financing models that government budgetary processes are not necessarily designed for. Yes, the private sector is going to need clear incentives to come to the table and be willing to work on those products. And sometimes it can feel easier to just design a purely donor-funded product that you can control from beginning to end. But by bringing together the government and the private sector, we can really build on each stakeholder's strengths and assets. And we've seen some really interesting models of public-private partnerships around the financing piece for some scaling programs that we would love to see replicated in many different places. So if we really want to durably transform outcomes for young people at scale, this multi-sector collaboration piece is going to be critical. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, who's going to give us a more detailed example of a financing mechanism for youth employment that has been implemented in Morocco. So over to you, Ryan.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Can I get a good morning? Okay, you're all still there. I saw you, but I didn't hear you, but I'm glad you're still there. I'm going to walk through a bit of an example. But before I do, I'll mention a couple things. We're the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And for those who aren't familiar, we're a U.S. government development agency funded directly by Congress with a singular mission of reducing poverty through economic growth. We use a model of selectivity in the countries that we work with to ensure that we're working with countries who are investing in their people, ruling justly, and promoting economic freedom. And at the heart of our model is a focus on results. And so the kind of results-based financing that we've been talking about in this session comes really natural to our model. These three sort of paradigms of support to delivery, support to government's ability to serve its people and achieve its outcomes are places where we've applied results-based financing. So first, incentivizing non-state delivery actors. So all governments rely on partners to deliver on their mandates. And so in Morocco, we'll talk about that at detail. In the agriculture sector in Mozambique, we've also got another program there doing just that. Secondarily, incentivizing government itself. So whether that be a line ministry incentivizing its frontline agents, national level to district level incentives or similar, or even in some cases, as we did in Sierra Leone, MCC setting up incentives for reform and improvements to delivery of water and energy utilities. And then last is also what I call the sort of blocking and tackling of service delivery, of performance-based financing, which is sometimes you just need to strengthen the system that sort of surrounds your delivery mechanisms. And we'll get into that very briefly here, but we also are looking at hopefully deploying those skills and tools elsewhere. So in Morocco, setting up a 5-year grant with the government of Morocco, establishing what's called a Millennium Challenge account. We had a $460 million compact, we call it, to address what were those binding constraints to inclusive economic growth. In this case, one of the key constraints we found was around including the most vulnerable populations in public employment services, support to job market intermediation, and then sort of more broadly making those programs effective for job seekers. So looks like I've lost a slide of mine, but I'll give you the short version. We sort of diagnosed our problem scenario with the government, ANAPEC, the Public Employment Agency, and their existing programs were already using results-based financing to try and, they had already tested, can you pay for better job placement and job retention outcomes? And really finding that both the providers were finding that the incentives around job placement were insufficient to even allow them to be profitable or cover their costs. Secondarily, that these were training providers. That's what they knew how to do. That's what they were mostly getting paid to do. They weren't really skilled in labor market intermediation. And then finally, just even the trainings, there was a sort of immature ecosystem of training providers to be able to deliver even high quality trainings that were relevant to the labor market. And then secondarily, on the inclusion side, what we found was that the existing programs really weren't open to the key populations, the more vulnerable populations. So effectively what that meant was only formal degree holders could even benefit from a lot of these existing programs, which leaves out a huge swath of the most vulnerable in Morocco. And so sort of seeing that disconnect, we set up a pilot to look at a couple different angles of this problem with ANAPEC, the government's public employment service. First was, the first objective there was, how do we actually get to a environment in which we understand what these outcomes cost, partially given the government's experience of recognizing that they had set a price point that was not allowing these providers to actually deliver that sort of supplementary service that you would need to get to those outcomes of placement and retention. And so that was really a critical step. And then secondarily, testing what models might work. We wanted to not just define, here's the intervention that we think might work, but rather sort of allow different models to be tested to see what seemed to work best for the populations that we wanted to work with. And then also, we really wanted to build on the effectiveness given sort of challenges, not just with the program that we're talking about, but sort of more broadly in Morocco, this struggle that a lot of employment programs are not considered all that effective at actually getting to those labor market outcomes. And so we set a sort of target of 70% job placement as what we really wanted to get to, and established our financial incentives around that. We hoped that this program would also sort of, by emphasizing the job placement and 6-month retention outcomes, we could actually strengthen the quality of the programs and their relevance to the labor market and the actual needs of the job seekers. And then we also explicitly incentivize different categories of job seekers, sort of what I call the putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to inclusion. And then finally, sort of this sort of blocking and tackling a little bit, which is recognizing that you really need to have effective digital systems that do verification efficiently and effectively, given that you're actually hoping to pay for those outcomes. I won't stop here for very long, other than to say that this is a fairly standard performance-based contracting approach to paying for results, establishing agreements with these 8 providers, which were across the private sector and civil society both, to sort of test different models, how it fits into this, and then have an independent audit of results that confirmed and verified results. And I'll also mention that Instiglio was a organization, nonprofit consulting organization that really did a lot to sort of ensure that we knew what we were doing, knew what we were getting into, and understood the risks of each step. So just a quick snapshot. What we ended up deploying was a program that prioritized youth as well as those with no formal degree. We had no real intervention that was pre-specified other than a minimum core of soft skills training identified as one of the pre-existing problems. And then we paid for formal job placement in the formal labor market as well as 6-month retention of continuous employment. Those objectives at the bottom there were set by the providers themselves, of them saying, here's the budget we're proposing and here's how much we think we can deliver with that budget. And the budget was actually expected to be larger. The pandemic slowed things down a bit, and the program took about twice as long to get fully implemented. So, but I do think that you'll see that even for a pilot program, we achieved a lot. I think I'll highlight sort of 3 factors on this slide of what we achieved. First, providers over-delivered on training. And that was not a purely coincidental, but I think when they started to realize that the labor market was much tighter or much harder than they expected to get job placements, and they were underperforming their own targets in terms of the actual job placement numbers, they said, we're willing to train more to get to that result that's the payable result. And so that overperformance is not sort of by happenstance or an accident that they didn't know how many they were supposed to train. Those additional were strategic, in a good sense of trying to actually get to those job placement numbers. Those empty white boxes, two things you'll notice: placement rate, 43%. That's at the upper end of the existing program that we were targeting, lower than what we expected. But I think we sort of scratched our heads for a bit and came away with two conclusions. One is that trying to, in the middle of a sort of grave economic crisis, trying to get non-degree holders placed into jobs is naturally going to be a really difficult thing to do. So meeting similar benchmarks with in a very hard economic time is not a bad thing. Secondarily, we worked with a much harder population, so naturally working with a population that was much further from the labor market and didn't really have the skills and backgrounds and qualifications that the program we were comparing to. So at net, I think we were fairly satisfied, though obviously didn't live up fully to the expectations in placement. But I think the key thing are those white boxes on both retention and placement. It's that the providers themselves also didn't know what they would be able to achieve ex ante. So we were not the only ones overestimating what was achievable, and I think that's one of the beauties of results-based financing, is it sort of makes concrete what you otherwise could sort of hand wave. And so I think there's sort of one or two key points I want to make on this final slide that I hope will set up an interesting conversation, which is, piloting is often the beginning of a path towards sort of scaling and sustainability. So as much as we sort of like to poo-poo the pilotitis of sort of let's just do another pilot, never scale anything, that is sort of the first step in a lot of reform, in a lot of sort of change making. And so we, I think, had a pretty successful pilot, and a lot of that is being sort of adopted into what the Ministry of Finance and others are doing. But then also another part of the government came to us midstream and said, wait a second, we didn't know that this was possible. We didn't know that we could actually do this. Can you give us some of the tools, tips? And they effectively took our model, replicated it for an organization within the government called INDH, the Initiative for Human Development. And that really is a testament to the fact that we, with no money of our own, were able to sort of just catalyze a bit of a change there. So I think that process of scaling is really challenging. I think that's the subject of this conversation. But I do think that that's like always needs to be our sort of final objective and where we have our heads. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Beth, Cyrielle, and Ryan. Really great to hear. But we really wanted this to be a conversation, and so I would like to open it up for any questions. I think we have a mic. Can anyone from Making Sense confirm we have a mic? Yes, Reed, thank you. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, right here.
Anita from Youth Business International. I've just booked myself into a follow-up conversation on this because this is all really, it's great work. I think you're asking the right questions, and I'm really interested to see how it rolls out. I just wanted to ask a particular question of Ryan. Yesterday, I was doing a workshop on YBI's Inclusivity Toolkit, and there was a really interesting discussion that took place afterwards, and I'm interested in the program you talked about, which was kind of twofold. One is, I mean, the soundbite I took out of it is that inclusion is disruptive, and there's a tension between wanting to achieve big numbers in a time-bound way, and the fact that inclusion very often is expensive and takes more time than very often a traditional program, would allow. So how do you square that circle in terms of both, the cost and the time that it would take to genuinely reach the groups that you're looking for versus some of the standard methodologies or protocols in development financing?
Sorry, I'm going to jump into your question for a second, Anita. Are you saying that the standard methodologies are working? Okay, sorry, just curious.
So I'm happy to sort of weigh in a little bit. I think for me, I would come back to the point of thinking specifically about financing, putting your money where your mouth is, and saying, like, for example, I'll give you one really concrete example. We, part of the way through this program, got a sort of avalanche of requests from providers saying, loosen your requirements, effectively, because we had set fixed placement targets for different categories of sort of more and less vulnerable populations, for women and for men. And we got a lot of requests of, well, come on, the pandemic, why don't you just let us do a bunch of male degree holders to make up for the results that we're not achieving in other populations? And that's a natural thing. And there were a few, none of those requests were granted. There were things, and we said, you know what, in the middle of a pandemic, to sort of say you have to have been out of the labor market for a full 12 months to benefit from this, maybe that's not reasonable, and we sort of revised that. But we didn't say, okay, fine, just do a bunch of degree holders because that's going to be a lot easier for you. So I do think that when it comes to inclusion, sort of like to apologize for repeating the point, putting our money where our mouth is and taking inclusion seriously as just part of doing business, not just sort of make sure you have a really nice proposal that sounds really inclusive, that you have the right modalities and whatnot, but that actually it is part and parcel to what we're aiming to achieve.
Hi, Nick Kafka from Teach Man to Fish. Another question to Ryan, sorry, but I mean, it seems like you've got such an interesting, sorry, you're blinded over there, an interesting focus on the numbers. So it seemed to me like the cost per person involved in that was around $3,000, something like that. Do you have how are you judging this not only in terms of that kind of cost and the outcomes of having people employed, but in terms of the return on investment, how much better they're doing, and how much kind of social value or economic value is being created out of that? It'd be really useful to understand some of those numbers, because I'm sure all of us here look at our programs and try and work out, what's a reasonable cost per participant, or what's a reasonable kind of outcome per participant, much as that varies across contexts.
So I'll be super brief, only because I don't want to dominate the conversation. I knew that being last in line, it's always easiest for me to get more questions. But I think the government, one of the great things about this was it was really, tied at the hip to the government. What is the government doing? How can we scale this eventually? There are a lot of programs up front who, for example, had populations where the provider said, this is going to cost us $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per capita. And the government said, we are never going to have Ministry of Finance authorization to pay that much per individual. So while this is an interesting pilot, we can't, that's never going to scale as much as we would like it to. And so I do think that the sort of cap was 1,000 per participant. I don't have the numbers in front of me to sort of, break that out across the different payment tranches. That's the complicated thing, is because there's sort of 3 different payment tranches. So, but in effect, the cost effectiveness benchmarking is the hardest part, because as we saw, we didn't actually know exactly how much would be achieved, and exogenous factors change how much can be achieved, and neither did our providers. So I think that's like the real takeaway for us.
Since I feel like saying something too,
Please
I
do.
just thought I'd add that we are working on this small bond in Mexico, and the cost per youth employed is also very high. So I'm new again to this sector, and that's what strikes me. I mean, everyone here knows the challenge is enormous, and the money from all sides is needed. It's both innovative finance, but it's also like grant. It's all needed, right? But the cost, I haven't seen it where it's low to do this work, and so that's all. But I actually wanted to come back to one of the points that Ryan made earlier about piloting. You know, I think even in this innovative finance, this work, it's critical to do that because you need to prove out the model and the ability to get repayments. You just need to prove it out before you can take these things to scale. Anyway, over.
Yeah, I would completely agree on that based on the research that we have done. Actually, like in Colombia, for instance, there's a number of really interesting examples where they started with those more complex, maybe models to implement at a small scale, so social impact bonds. They then did an outcomes fund, which is a slightly higher scale than SIB, and now they're turning to performance-based contracts at a much, much higher scale, so simpler design, higher scale. But the reason they've been able to do this is because the social impact bonds, the outcomes funds, demonstrated the validity of the approach to their government partners. So really critical to pilot. Yeah. Well, one more thing actually that I wanted to add, sorry, about the costs per young people. I think we need to always bring back that conversation to the business case also for that investment, right? There is a cost, but the cost, for instance, to the government in terms of lost income taxes from that young person not being able to get a job is potentially much higher in the long run. So that's something to bring in.
Actually, you make a really interesting point. So some of you may not know how these kinds of instruments came about to begin with. It was the first, I think one of the first impact bonds was a recidivism bond in New York City, and it was looking at the prisoner return to prison. And the government did an analysis on how much that was costing versus how much it would cost to implement projects to keep repeat offenders out of prison. So that's how these all kind of got started, was doing that analysis.
Any other questions?
So just kind of hi everyone, I'm Joanna Ramos Romero with CRS. Piggybacking off of this question and comments about cost per youth, cost per participant, is that really the right metric? I'm thinking of, there was an article in Harvard Business Review that came out 5 years ago at this point, and it proposed this metric of cost per employed day. And I wonder, and it was kind of making the case of, if we look at a training program that has like a cost per youth of $1,000, but the young people, they have a job placement rate of 50% and the young people stay on the job for only 60 days, is that a good cost per youth compared to another program that's like $2,000 per youth, the job placement rate is 80% and they stay on the job for 120 days or more. And I just wonder, in your experience, have you heard of this metric? Is that possibly an attractive metric for this kind of financing?
I can try to take this one. So I haven't come across that particular metric, but certainly I think it just reinforces the need to have that data on placement and retention to assess the programs that we invest in. And this comes back to my second takeaway. Like, we need to look at how the funding that we have available is being used, and not just at how much funding is being directed towards those programs. And by doing that, we also drive we drive skilling providers to start measuring and tracking those outcomes, and we're able to better inform our decision making.
Any other questions? Petula. Just up here.
Hi everyone, I'm Petula Nash with CRS and been working on this. And the question I'm asked might be also of interest to some others. I think there's been a lot of conversation about the enabling environment, right? And what are some of those key factors that you've seen has really been kind of critical? I know in the report that we're working on, that's one of the things we try to pull out. What is it about the enabling environment that really is more appropriate for certain types of mechanisms? So I thought this might be also a good question that some others may have that the panelists could share a bit on.
And I would love to hear from the impact bond in Mexico, because Ryan, no offense. But I would love to first hear from you, Beth, specifically the enabling environments in Mexico for that.
Well, I can actually broaden that to even talk about doing innovative finance in a large, and impact investing in a large international nonprofit, because there is an enabling environment conversation there as well. So, and what is important for me is to have a really strong collaboration with the experts in the area, and that's my friends that are here. So that's part of it. To be honest, I mean, an enormous part of the work we do. But on the bond side in Mexico, we have a really engaged and private sector focused region, the government of Nuevo Leon, Mexico. It's very interested in these kinds of instruments, and also have taken a look at, what is the cost of having unemployed youth. And we have an excellent implementing partner. It's all very key. I'm not sure if I'm answering that, so yeah. And then having the youth that are engaged and looking for, so yeah.
I'll only say briefly that I think coming back to the question of sort of informing government practice, right? This sort of donor money is a drop in the bucket when it comes to the ability to actually deliver. And so, and you might think I'm going to make the blended finance point. I'm not going to make the blended finance point. I'm actually going to make the point of how do we inform how governance improves and how governments build their own capacities to deliver for their people. And so for us, that's really the enabling environment factor that meant a lot to us, was that the Ministry of Finance was moving in this direction with their ministry partners at the Ministry of Labor and their other sort of frontline delivery. So that to me is the enabling factor to look out for, that actually you can have an influence on what's actually happening.
And then maybe at a higher level, I think I would say on the skilling side, on the skilling side, the quality of the partners is key, both on the government side, but also on the skilling side, the skilling providers that you're going to be working with. Like in some contexts, you're just not going to have enough high quality skilling providers to implement some of those models at scale. And so you can start with maybe a pilot, and you work with the top quality skilling provider in the ecosystem, and you demonstrate the effectiveness of the model. And by that, you may create and influence the rest of the ecosystem to progress and improve its quality. But yes, the quality of the skilling providers is going to be a limiting, the number of high quality skilling providers may be a limiting factor in some contexts. So that's one. On the job creation side, when you're looking at investing into businesses, whether youth employing or youth-led businesses, you need the right environment for businesses to grow. As we know, this goes way beyond financing. You need a supportive regulatory environment for business growth. You need public infrastructure. You need good public governance. So there are a number of factors that are a bit outside of the control of just one financing mechanism. So yeah, these are all things that we call out in the report and that are important to consider when you're looking at which financing mechanism is going to be most effective for the context you're looking at.
Thank you. Since I have the microphone, oh no, do you have a question? Yeah, go for it. This is the final question, by the way.
One of the magical things, or the magic tricks of this financing model is getting all the incentives aligned with the different stakeholders. But one of the incentives that I am worried about is if you are paying for the delivery of a certain outcome, the incentive would be to get, to target beneficiaries that are as close to that outcome border as possible, rather than sort of like targeting, so you're not paying for the distance you take someone from that outcome so much as just crossing the line. So how do we solve for that perverse incentive to change your target?
Great question. Go ahead.
This is a question I struggled with a lot in the due diligence. We actually started, we did due diligence for an impact bond, and sort of I spent a lot of time thinking about this question, and I think there are a couple key tools in our toolkit. One is rate cards, scorecards, effectively sort of fixing different populations according to their vulnerability. I do think that there is still some potential, but instead of, if you picture it as sort of multiple thresholds, if you've got a single rate and all you're doing is taking people who are at this threshold and above this threshold, if you're sort of setting multiple rates, effectively you're at least bringing some of the different people into that conversation. You are still have to be okay with the nature of the work, which is those different people, there's always going to be sub populations who are more vulnerable or are even further from the labor market. And you have to sort of understand those different dynamics. But I also, I want to flag the second tool, which is in labor market work, retention, right? Because I worked as an employment counselor for World Relief many years ago doing refugee resettlement employment. And I quickly learned that it is not that hard to get someone into a job. It's quite difficult to get that person to retain that job because you have to be a match for what they're looking for, their career, their life realities. Do they have a car? What, actually make a real substantial match. So I think programs that are only paying for job placement, I think are dangerous for a lot of that reason that you highlighted. If you can get job retention results, who stays in a job for 6 months that they don't want to do, right? So anyhow, I really appreciate the question.
To say that's again goes back to the collaboration with our youth team in that we, CRS works with the most poor and vulnerable around the world, and partnering with the implementer Youth Build Mexico, it's looking at who are we targeting, what are the right communities and youth to be targeting, and that's where our folks come in to ensure that we are in fact moving beyond just the easy one.
Yes. Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for engaging. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists? Yeah, excellent questions from the audience. I know this topic can seem daunting, but I hope that through this session, you guys realize the importance of the topic. We were able to share the main findings of the report, and I think also profile an initiative through Ryan's presentation. And I think we demonstrated, hopefully, the potential of different financing mechanisms to really address the scale and the inclusion challenge in youth unemployment. So we at CRS, GDI, MCC, and GOIN, we look forward to continuing to share our learnings and our experiences, and hopefully within the next few months share the Fin Youth report with you all. Lastly, as noted, I would like to thank Mark over here, Corsac from Seeing Colors, who was able to capture both the discussion and the panel. And feel free to take a look at it after this session and during your breaks. I think we're going to put it up here. And I'll hand it off to our organizers. Thank you all.